Alrighty. Well, happy Friday, everybody. It's finally the weekend. Okay, so it's a good day, and what we're gonna do today is kind of focus on transitioning from the imperialist power that is becoming the United States, and kind of analyze some events in which we kind of show that we are becoming just like every other European nation in our ways of kind of dealing with foreign policy. Remember last time, and I'll kind of let me get this stuff out of the way. Last time, we mentioned how the United States used to always be a force for um, being an isolation, like neutral party when it comes to all the foreign policy type of issues, and we used to be like that uh, because George Washington was kind of the leader on how we should act, and then obviously we kind of turned around and said, George, you're just worrying too much, right? No, we're not going to be like that. We're not going to have any issues, and then we did. We first started being a power that focused on manifest destiny, like expanding as much as humanly possible, right? And then we kind of ran out of room, and then we went into becoming what they call an imperialist nation, which is instead of just staying in our borders, we now expand everywhere else. That's kind of where we left off, and we talked about the reasoning why each side has their point of views, right? And that was what you did yesterday in the document. You analyzed two different sources, and saw why one person might be more for imperialism while the other one was saying no, that's kind of wrong. And some sources are very interesting, like even cases of like Theodore Roosevelt, right? And we're going to talk a lot about him in this unit. And he was kind of the person of saying, be a imperialist because we can secure peace, right? That was his reasoning. Others felt like it was their mission as a white Anglo-Saxon to spread, Christianity and democracy to as many places as possible. And others are saying, listen, what we're doing is wrong, is honorably wrong. Like, we were a nation that was imperialized, and we felt that we had the right to rebel and become our own nation. So why is it that we are now pushing our will onto others? And that was kind of the debate going on. And this debate's going to continue, specifically the idea of should the Constitution follow the flag, and that's why I wanted to kind of go back and focus on this, because this is going to be a growing issue as we get into the Spanish American War and also the aftermath of that war. Okay, so let's continue. So the Spanish American War is really going to be an important topic because of not just because the war was so massive in scale or anything, but I mean it was pretty quickly dealt with. But leading up into the conflict shows you kind of the how how much America was already itching to expand its territory. And the essential question of the day is going to be, why did America go to war with Spain? Pretty straightforward. So let's analyze the reasonings why. Okay, so imperialism is really going to be considered the most important reasoning behind the Spanish American War. Okay, and when we are looking at where should we go next with all of our land, wanting to grab land, we look to the Caribbean. We look to the most closest islands that we could find, and we were always trying to obtain Cuba in some manner because it was so close to the United States, and also because we found it was super profitable with its access to the sugar trade. Okay, and we wanted to gain. We actually had a lot of investors already have a piece of it, but now we wanted to kind of own it for ourselves. That was kind of the goal. So by the 1890s, a lot of Americans wanted to basically control Cuba so that they can make the most money out of it instead of us having investors in there or having just trade relationships. We want to own the entire trade. Okay, so a lot of these imperialists demanded from the United States government to basically expand into these islands and to other islands in Central and South America, because they felt as if we do this, we can become more profitable than ever before. But the presidents at the time, like Grover Cleveland and President McKinley, were a little uneasy about just jumping into a conflict because remember, these islands are controlled by other nations. Specifically, Cuba was controlled by Spain. So by basically, you know, amounting your will into an island is going to jumpstart a war. And obviously, no president is going to be wanting to go to war because obviously that's just not the smart thing to do. Just because people were itching to gain more access to trade or land, that's not smart. So this is obviously going to cause a lot of issues, a lot of tensions to grow. So let's look at some of the causes. One of the first ones is going to be the Cuban Revolt. Now, Cuba had these nationalists that were trying to gain their independence from Spain. And basically what ends up happening is Spain ends up sending a very tyrannical general known as Valeriano Weyler, right? And he basically is sent to put down this revolt. And basically, the nationalists of Cuba were basically trying to destroy all the sugar plantations to basically try to make Spain feel as if, it's not worth dealing with this conflict. But now it's going to escalate even further, especially with the introduction of these 100,000 soldiers that were sent to put down this rebellion. Basically, what ends up happening is because of the leadership of Weyler, they actually sent a lot of these nationalists into these almost very close to concentration camps. Okay, and it kind of shows that how brutal he was. And Americans actually in the journal in the press would actually label him as the butcher of Spain, and they'd be having all these different cartoons of him literally look like an animal because they wanted to kind of paint him as being this evil person, and obviously what he was doing was pretty messed up. But obviously, by doing that, it makes the American public look at what Spain is and say, we need to intervene. We need to do something. And obviously, with people already itching to get to Cuba, you can see that that's going to cause some more problems. Now, to add on to this, right, during this time period, there's this thing called the yellow press or yellow journalism. And what you guys know what yellow journalism is? I'm sure you've heard of it before. Say it again. Over-exaggerated news.
Good morning, students and faculty. This is Mr. Colombo. Happy Friday. Please excuse this interruption. Two quick announcements. Students, please, I sent out a survey yesterday to get some feedback around our potential plans for April, May, and June. Please take a look at that and complete it when you get a moment. And then also, this is a message for all members of our community here. Please be vigilant about your masks in the building. I recognize that the numbers are down, people are feeling comfortable, and at the same time, I'm going to ask you to please keep that mask on. Don't hang it below your nose. Let's continue the trend that we currently see, and I hope you all have a wonderful day. Take care. Bye.
All right, good. Yeah, so yellow journalism is over-exaggerated press. And the two leading papers of the time, specifically in New York, were Joseph Pulitzer's New York World and William Randolph Hearst's New York Journal. All right, and these two sources were competing with one another to see who can get the most views. So whenever that's the case, you could see that these two newspapers will all automatically just start overreacting to every little thing that was happening. All right, and basically they were trying to push this conflict with Spain as being their major issue that was always on the headlines of the newspapers all the time. So anytime there was something little about the conflict with Spain, it would be all over the place, right? And they would always make it like the whole incident with Weyler. That was front page news, cartoons all over the place, painting him as being the butcher. Okay. Now, what ends up escalating this was there was actually a Spanish diplomat, Duque de Lome, who actually had sent a letter basically to back and forth with people, somebody from Spain, and the letter got leaked. The letter had stated basically a high criticism of President McKinley for not really, stepping in to kind of stop the Cuban nationalists from doing what they were doing. And when this was leaked to the news press, basically Americans were now saying they insulted us as Americans. We need to do something. Right. And like I said, in the background, you have to understand Americans wanted to get involved. Right. You can tell they really wanted to get a piece of the sugar trade. So every little thing that was happening was only making them become louder and louder and louder to the point where it got out of hand. So just to kind of escalate things even more, less than a week, after the Delome letter hit the headlines, February 15th, 1898, the U.S. battleship Maine exploded off the harbor of Havana, Cuba. Okay. Now, Americans were killed. 260 Americans had died on board. But the question of how did this happen gets put into the air, right? The yellow journalism went rampant. The two newspapers I mentioned, the New York World and New York Journal, had posted that the Spanish had blown up the Maine, even though later on they had found that it was just an accident. the battleship just blew, it must have been a gas, like some sort of a leak, exploded, and Americans had died, obviously, but it was already too late. The headlines had already painted Spain as being the culprit of this, and now everyone was in uproar. And we're going to analyze this more in the activities, seeing the different points of views of this. But basically, what ends up happening is McKinley sends an ultimatum to Spain, okay, saying that there should be a ceasefire in Cuba, as in there should be stopping of the conflict. And what happens? Spain actually agrees. They cease fire. However, McKinley put that ultimatum out there thinking that Spain would actually disagree, and then they would have to, all right, then we'll go to war. So what he does even further is he sends even more demands, basically telling Spain to leave Cuba. And that wasn't going to happen. So when they refuse to leave Cuba, the headlines are now painted that, we're itching towards war. And the American public was now, basically on board with going to war. Congress jumps on the same bandwagon. We end up putting a declaration of war by April 20th. But within that resolution, we put forward what they call the Teller Amendment. And basically, this is a subsection of this war resolution that says that once we help the Cuban nationalists gain their independence, we will give the power back to the Cubans to control themselves. All right, and we'll right from there, let's go into the activity of the day, the causes of the Spanish-American War. And you're going to analyze kind of the different perspectives of the kind of the points leading up into the conflict itself. So let's take a look at it. Okay. All right, so what you're going to do is at the very top here, there is this link. It says documents 1 and 2. Okay, so once you click on this link, it'll send you to a Google Doc. And this is going to have basically all the documents that you're going to need, all right, for this activity. All right, so let me first do a split screen to do it this way so it makes it a little easier to understand what I'm talking about. The first part, and we'll break up into 2 groups to do this, is you're going to be analyzing the documents 1 and 2. And I kind of put a little kind of color-coded separation so you can see what you're going to be doing for each part. So part 1 is only going to be a point of view analysis of these newspaper articles, all right, the Journal and the Times. So by looking at these 2 articles, you're going to first write what differences do you notice about the 2 different accounts? Secondly, what kinds of evidence do they use in each of these 2 different journal articles? And what might account for or explain these differences? What story seems to be trustworthy and why? Okay, so let's first get started with that. So get in your groups and let's first analyze these 2 newspaper articles. Do we want to talk about it?
Yeah.
All right, let's go into this first one here. All right, so first part of this is what differences do you notice between the 2 accounts? So what are some things you notice between the 2 newspaper articles you saw?
So one's like kind of over exaggerating everything. They're offering a reward and they're talking about how a ship was blown up by a mine, while the other one is talking more about like irrational truth about how they're going to go find out what happened as opposed to just straight out being attacked out.
Yeah, one thing you noticed right away, like between the 2, like headlines.
The other one has a lot bigger plot involved in it. Well,
There's a whole lot going on this one, right? The New York Journal, and this one, the 2 that I kind of mentioned, right? There's so much stuff on here. Not only is there a headline to give you a little extra at the bottom, convinced, like it says, Assistant Secretary Roosevelt is convinced that the explosion of the warship was not an accident. Then it has 2 little banners that talk about rewards for $50,000, right? And it says for the detection of the perpetrator of the main outrage, right? Like this is all this stuff is all toward that same thing. And the other one is kind of more just a straightforward, Ames Hall will decide, let's analyze this. We'll take a look. And it looks, obviously the first one we just said, it was more appealing, right? Definitely looks more appealing. Randy, you want to add something to that? Because I saw your hand was up. You good? Okay. So what kinds of evidence do they use for these articles? Let's first look at the Journal. Yeah, go ahead.
They say that some officials have confirmed that Harrison Hill, after that was developed,
says that these models have affected enemies faster.
Good. Yeah, go ahead, Aaron. Good, right? A lot more conspiracy theory type of tinfoil hat type of talk. Not a lot of like, evidence to prove its point, just some kind of saying stuff out there to kind of drag the reader in. Anything else want to add for this? Let's compare it to the Times. Let's look at the Times. What's some of the evidence that they are talking about here? Yeah, go ahead, Travis. No, yeah, go ahead, Travis.
So they quote naval officers, officials, maybe a lot of logistical conclusion about the opinion.
Good. More logistical view, more using data driven. Anything else you want to add to that? Good. So there's a difference, a stark difference between how they're gaining their evidence here. What might account for or explain the differences? What story seems more trustworthy and why? Let's look at that next one. What do we think for this? Yeah, Aaron. Good, right? You can clearly tell that there is by the approaches they're taking, one of them is more politically driven, the other one is more taking just an analytical view of what's going on. They're covering, they're generally known for their trustworthiness, right? When it comes to just looking at evidence first, rather than just using political emotion, okay? So which one would you deem to be more trustworthy? The Times, right? The Times, because it's more kind of, let's analyze the data first before we make a decision. So by looking at that first part, this first part we just said here, based on so far, now there's a lot more stuff that can be involved in the Spanish-American War. What would you say would be the leading cause of the war? What do you think?
Of the war,
Yeah,
I would say it's like, it's kind of a mix between false information and people kind of like wanting to go to war and looking for almost anything.
yeah, Aaron, you add to that? Basically, like we most American citizens were itching to expand, right? They really, really wanted a reason to go into Cuba. They really wanted one. And the newspapers did them the favor, right? They gave them a reason to say, you should be in uproar. The main exploded. Spain's fault, guaranteed. You're like, see, I knew it. I knew we should have got involved. It's like that one person that always like has to say that they're right, even though at the end of the day, like, oh, all right, I knew this was coming at some point. Like, I knew it. I told you, right, since day one, should have got involved in Cuba, right? And that this is their reasoning, right? Even though later on they find out it really didn't explode, but it wasn't like Spain's fault that did it, but it was like, oh, well, then don't worry about it. But now let's move on to the next part. So the next part is actually, it's going to give you more leeway to pick and choose documents that are going to kind of help you when you're trying to gather your argument toward what are the causes of the war. Okay, so when you look at now where it says part 2, it has a little green shading here. I'll say the kind of the directions. What you're going to do is there's actually like, I think 7 documents total. You are going to pick with your group 3 to 5 to kind of support a reasoning why, what was the cause of the war, right? And there are a good amount of them, right? All different variations of types. And the questions that go with them, you don't have to answer, right? So there are close reading questions for each document. Those are just going to help you understand what are things you should be looking for, right? Don't answer the questions because that's just a lot more work than you need to do. By looking at the specific documents you're choosing, you're going to, in the left column, say what was the cause of going to war, citing a document, okay? So like, let's just say the example, they say nationalism. You're going to say which document that goes with, and then in the right column, you're going to say the evidence. So in document blank, it says this, and it connect it to your argument. Very similar to like what we did with a DDQ, right? It's going to help you kind of understand how to not only describe a document and based on its purpose, but also connect it to an argument that you're trying to propose. All right. So with your group, you're only picking 3 to 5 documents to use, right? You're not picking all 7, pick 3 to 5. All right. Now within Zoom, I'm going to put you all in one group to work on this as a unit. All right. So get started on that part, and we will reconvene as we get a little closer to the end of the period.